The late Schelling invites misunderstanding because he is articulating a fundamentally new way of doing philosophy after the high watermark of the Western metaphysical tradition, that is, after German idealism. His goal is to render philosophy adequate to an emergent order, not a determinate order, but a determinable process that begins in an event which is less real than its consequences. The coherency criterion of truth becomes, in Schelling's later work, subordinate to the criterion of adequacy. To say that a system is coherent, that it supports itself, does not involve any contradictions, perhaps even is self-generative out of its first axioms, is not to say that it is a system of reality. That system is true, which not only coheres and achieves self-consistency, but which is also adequate to human experience. This would mean that the system explains everything that needs to be explained. Given the incompleteness of natural and human history, any proposed system must remain open to falsification by any new experience, which is proven to be inexplicable under its terms. The contradiction of the system of reality is in some ways the construction of the system of reality, and perhaps the contradiction of the system of reality, is in some ways an infinite and always falsifiable task, but not for that reason futile or absurd. This line of argumentation may be familiar to us from pragmatism or process philosophy, but it is widely known that the central trajectory of post-Hegelian speculative philosophy, whether it be Peirce's speculative philosophy, Whitehead's, Collingwood's, or that of the late Canadian philosopher James Bradley, of whom I shall speak a bit later on in this talk, that this trajectory begins in the late Schelling's distinction between negative and positive philosophy. The negative philosophy, which is Schelling's late term for a priorism, the philosophy of reason or idealism, must be coherent and abstract. And the work of constructing a coherent system of concepts is the great achievement of Kant and post-Kantian philosophy. But positive philosophy, empirical philosophy, the philosophy of the real or historical philosophy demands something other of the philosopher than coherent reasoning, intuition of first principles, a priori deduction. Positive philosophy demands a form of thinking that is adequate, not to reason alone, but to history in the broadest sense of the term, that is to the human experience of emergent order, which is an empirical ordering of things that are otherwise unrelated, a discovery of an order which begins chaotic, random, and unpredictable, and the telos of which is uncertain, but which is no less intelligible for that. The high point of negative philosophy or idealism had been achieved by Hegel, the late Schelling argued, in a tribute to his former colleague, who died in 1831, just as Schelling's positive philosophy was taking shape. Should he have completed the system and asked, but does it explain life as we in fact live it, suffer it, and desire it? Hegel would have broken through to the positive. That Schelling believed Hegel failed in this regard is old news. What is not widely enough recognized is the degree to which Schelling believed Hegel succeeded. He succeeded in giving definitive, if not final, expression to the true system of reason. This was a great contribution, according to Schelling, because idealism is not accidental to the philosophical project. On the contrary, idealism in all its forms, subjective, objective, or absolute, is necessary to achieving a philosophically adequate realism. The innate content of reason must be articulated. It must be made explicit, for it is always already implicitly determining thought. Idealism makes the implicit content of reason explicit, but for this very reason, it has only a negative relation to reality. Is the audio okay? Good. So let me start with, that was by way of introduction. Let me start with some remarks on what I call the Kantian clue. In many texts from his later period, Schelling argues that Kant's real contribution was to have inaugurated positive philosophy, the philosophy of existence or historical philosophy. Only Kant himself did not know that he had done so. For it was Kant who demonstrated that idealism was both a necessary product of thinking and an inadequate one. In idealism, thought gives definition to the architectonic of reason, not only in the deduction of the forms of the categorical synthesis of sense data, but also in the anticipated intelligible totality of the one world in which all categorical syntheses inhere. Thought expresses the system of reason in its constitutive and necessary anticipation of absolute intelligibility. The system of being in which every categorical proposition is logically, that is necessarily related to every other. The keystone in the architectonic of reason, as you all probably know, is the idea of the unconditioned, the totality of all predicates inherent in the ens perfectissimum. Thought does not arrive at the unconditioned arbitrarily for Kant. The idea is rather the necessary and always implicit operative presupposition of any relative or conditioned categorical claim, for it secures the ordered relation of all relative claims to one another. At the same time, Kant demonstrated that the intelligible whole, which thought anticipates, is only immanent. The unconditioned grounds a system of reason, not of reality. By making the innate content of reason explicit, Kant gestures to the possibility of that which is genuinely transcendent to reason, that which precedes reason and determines it from without, but he leaves us with no means to approach it. Not unlike the early Wittgenstein, Kant vaguely and none too consistently demarcates the transcendent in disputable terms as the practical, the order of freedom, or the noumenal, a domain forbidden to thought, but familiar, he says, to religious faith. What Schelling will demand is a philosophical means for moving beyond the immanent system of reason into the transcendent. Kant was right that the immanent cannot be made transcendent, but nothing, he said, Schelling argues, precludes us from seeking a way of making the transcendent immanent. And now a citation from the Grounding of the Positive Philosophy, the 1842 lectures of Schelling, which were translated by Bruce Matthews in 2007. If I infer from the idea of the most supreme being its existence, then this is a transcending. I first posited the idea and now wish to pass from it over into existence. Here is then a transcendence. If, however, I proceed from that which is anterior to all concepts, then I have surpassed nothing. And on the contrary, if one calls this being transcendent and I advance within it to its concept, then I have surpassed the transcendent, and in this way again become immanent. The transcendence of the was merely relative, that is, timid and half-hearted, whereby one wanted to remain with one foot stuck in the concept. The transcendence of the positive philosophy is an absolute transcendence, and for precisely this reason is not transcendent in the sense in which Kant had forbidden it, end quote. But how does one begin in the transcendent? How does one begin from that which is, quote, anterior to all concepts? And how does one build on such a non-concept, assuming that we could begin there? Schelling's philosophy of the genuinely transcendent must avoid a trap, the trap into which Hegel fell, of assuming that the method will be logical or enable a logical, i.e. a conceptually necessary transition from the immanent to the transcendent. A logical transition from a concept of being to existence, precisely because it remains within the logical, can only ever constitute a move within the immanent system of reason. Thought is tempted to do so because it has an internal drive towards totality. But if it lets itself go in this direction, it becomes deceived that it has imminently overcome its own finitude. The result is an inevitable apotheosis of the immanent and a self-inflation of the human, which was Hegel's fundamental error. The move from the negative to the positive, from the immanent to the transcendent, and back into the immanent in a new way, Schelling argues, in intimation of Kierkegaard, I might say, who was in the Berlin lecture room in 1841 when Schelling formulated the argument. This is not an act of reason at all. It is an act of will. More specifically, a decision. Kant himself was halfway there with his, quote, making room for faith, end quote, which amounts to a delimitation of the negative, the ideal, on the basis of some previous decision with regard to the positive. Kant does not want immanence at all. He is not in the least content with idealism, and hence places a refutation of it in the middle of the first critique. This is a passage from Schelling's On the History of Modern Philosophy, an 1833 lecture he gave, which has been translated by Andrew Bowie. Kant's critique contributed to this, what I'm calling the turn to the positive, all the more because it was in no way hostile towards the positive. Whilst he demolishes the whole edifice of that metaphysics, he always makes his view clear that in the last analysis, one must want what it wanted. Das man, the German is important here, das man am Ende wollen müsse, was sie gewollt habe. And that its content would in fact finally be the true metaphysics if it were only possible, end quote. Notice how Schelling describes Kant's position vis-a-vis the positive as a wollen, a desire, a wanting, a volitional intention, which is not in any way irrational, even if it is not a move within reason itself. It is on the non-substantive, preconceptual foundation of this wollen that Schelling will establish his speculative theology. Here is the nub of Schelling's metaphysical voluntarism, which has deep roots in the Hebrew Bible, to which Schelling was deeply attached. His father was a scholar of Hebrew, after all, and which goes on to have a massive, if still unrecognized, impact on later 19th century philosophy. Kierkegaard, of course, Schelling and Marx, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Peirce all fall under the influence of Schelling's metaphysics of will. As Schelling puts it in the purely rational philosophy, the last piece he was working on when he died, 1854, the turn to the positive requires, quote, a practical drive, ein praktischer Antrieb, something that lies outside of the necessary, something willed, end quote. What is willed is a comprehensive explanation for everything. That is an explanation that leaves nothing out, a self-explanatory explanation. Schelling has no difficulty recognizing that only an existing creator God could satisfy such a demand. Schelling's speculative theology then aims to go beyond Kant while recognizing and to some degree maintaining the limits of the understanding mapped by Kant. God is no more an object of thought for Schelling than he was for Kant. Rather, God is approached as a subject. The question becomes, has God revealed God's self in history? The dynamics of personal knowledge, the person's knowledge of other persons, conditional as it is upon the free disclosure of the other, in a quotidian way in our daily moral life, shall be extrapolated in a speculative application to the possibility of a self-disclosure of an infinite personality, the subject, not the object of revelation. The absolute subject, divine personality, will remain as Kant described it, quote from Kant, the abyss of human reason, der Abgrund der menschlichen Vernunft, the unconditioned necessity which we need so indispensably as the ultimate sustainer of all things, end quote from Kant. That's the Critique of Pure Reason. But where Kant constructed a philosophy designed to avoid falling into this abyss, Schelling takes the opposite direction and plunges directly in. Now, at this point, I would change the slide and you'd see a title that's called The Forgetfulness of Being. The place to begin the exposition of Schelling's speculative theology is his return to Kant's critique of the ontological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument is the essence of idealism, whether the idealist formulates the argument or not. It is the attempt to demonstrate a presumed identity of thought and being. The God who guarantees this identity in the argument, the idealist's absolute, is not what is wanted at all by either Kant or Schelling. The unconditioned, das unbedingt, is manifestly not a divine person, but merely a regulative ideal, or if you want, an innate idea, what Casper called in his fine book on the late Schelling, the figure and form of reason itself, end quote. Objectified. The system of reason objectified in an idea, an inescapable idea, and its inescapability, the way all paths of thinking lead to it, for it is the idea which alone makes thought possible, leaves open the question, Schelling's question. Does being, in fact, hold sway as God? The idea of the unconditioned is of no use here. In the idea of infinity, reason knows nothing more nor less than itself, and in an abstraction from its own existence. Targeted in Schelling's critique of the ontological argument is not only the a priori proof for the existence of God, but the illegitimacy of any idealist transition from logic to history. While he is drawn to the positive and endeavors in his own way to overcome the negative, Hegel assumes just such a transition and essentializes existence. Negative philosophy is inevitable, and so there is an undeniable truth to the Hegelian system. In it, reason follows its own immanent logic, but for all that remains no less protected from the real. Only the fearless advance of metaphysical questioning, the refusal to silence the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there reason and logic in the first place? Only this can open reason to the genuinely transcendent, which it routinely disavows. Schelling does not deny that reason appears to sublate the transcendent and that concepts seem to penetrate things to their intelligible core. But why is there reason at all? Whence intelligibility as such? The question is at least intelligible, for reason cannot coherently deny its own existence. But its existence, in turn, demands a reason, an explanation, for reason is manifestly not self-explanatory. The next citation is also from the History of Modern Philosophy, the 1833 lecture. One of the more famous of Schelling's citations should be familiar to you. Schelling writes, everything can be in the logical idea without anything being explained thereby. As for example, everything in the sensuous world is grasped in number and measure, which does not thereby mean that geometry or arithmetic explain the sensuous world. The whole world lies, so to speak, in the nets of the understanding or of reason. But the question is, how exactly it got into those nets, since there is obviously something other and something more than mere reason in the world. And there, indeed, there is something which strives beyond those barriers. End quote. What is missing in Hegel is the wanting, das Wollen, that Kant was so sensitive to, the drive for more than thought, which could have led him to the shattering question that destabilizes the rationality of the real, with the possibility that it need not be. This is the question so deceptively simple. Why is the real rational? Why is it ordered and not rather disordered? The question is easy to state, but it is something else altogether to feel it, to suffer it, and out of this anxiety to demand an answer. Insofar as idealism cannot explain the existence of order as such, it cannot claim the completeness which it presupposes. Existence cannot be deduced transcendentally or dialectically. It can only be known per posterius, that is, through experience. More precisely, through an existential act of self-problematization, which disrupts the which disrupts the ideal and awakens the existing subject from the dream of reason by refusing to allow him or her to continue to suppress reason's de facto incomprehensibility. Because of the incompleteness of existence, what Heidegger will call its historicity, a philosophically adequate discourse can never presume absoluteness. It must always stand open to a disruptive disclosure, a revelation of the transcendent. The next section is how to become a realist. I'm tempted to call it a self-help manual. We'll see. And it also starts with a passage, this from The Grounding of the Positive Philosophy, the 1842 lecture, Berlin lecture. Schelling says, thus, far from man and his endeavors making the world comprehensible, it is man himself that is the most incomprehensible, and who inexorably drives me to the belief in the wretchedness of all being, a belief that makes itself known in so many bitter pronouncements from both ancient and recent times. It is precisely man that drives me to the final desperate question, why is there anything at all? Why is there not nothing? End quote. The turn to the positive, the turn from idealism to realism, only occurs when the philosopher decides that the above question can no longer be ignored. The turn is a decision, not the conclusion of a rational process. Idealism does not of necessity subject itself to the criterion of adequacy, which would drive it out of itself, render it ecstatic, on the look for the explanation for that which really exists. In the turn to the positive, the philosopher confronts what existentialists will later call the feeling of absurdity. The philosopher can turn to the positive because he or she is already in the positive. Why not thrown into it? The philosopher exists and thinks from out of that unprethinkable fact, which at first astonishes philosophy and renders it silent. The difference between Schelling and the existentialists is that where the latter regarded the incomprehensibility of existence as a gloomy conclusion of the search for meaning, Schelling regards it as a premise. Eternal existence, unprethinkable existence, the sheer thatness of the world, das reine das, initially silences reason, to be sure. But this silence awakens the philosopher into a new line of questioning. The task is not to give up philosophizing in the face of the inexplicably real. The task is to philosophize in a new way, to enter into philosophy with one's actual existence hanging in the balance. The next quote is from Schelling's Erste Vorlesung in Berlin, the first lecture in Berlin in 1841. This was actually translated in an American pragmatist journal, transcendentalist journal in the 19th century. So it's quite likely the first piece of the late Schelling that somebody like Charles Sanders Peirce would have had a chance to read. Schelling says, "Never before has such a powerful reaction on the part of life been raised against philosophy than in this moment. This proves that philosophy has penetrated into those questions concerning life that it is not permitted, indeed even possible, to be indifferent towards. As long as philosophy is in its first beginnings or in the first stages of its progress, no one who has not himself made philosophy the business of his life cares for it." End quote. The question concerning existence, like all questions, discloses something about the questioned. It discloses that that which is questioned is neither wholly unintelligible, for of the wholly unintelligible no question could be asked, nor is it wholly intelligible or transparent to reason, for if it were, the question would have no force. It would be merely a rhetorical question, not a cry of the heart. The existence that so burdens the questioner is an ordered chaos, a partial intelligibility, an incomplete reality. Since order, tenuous, contingent, and precarious, rules over disorder in the universe as it in fact exists, and since order is neither necessary nor eternal, something, Schelling hypothesizes, must have occurred, which had as its consequence the existence of order. This hypothesized event could not be a passage from potency to act. It could only be a passage from act to potency, since potency as such, potency or essence, the conceptualizable, is the product of the event. An event that is not preceded by potency cannot be comprehended a priori. It is unprethinkable. It has no essence which predetermines it. It only has an essence, if it has an essence at all, post factum. Since the event is the production of intelligible order as such, it would be strange to call it irrational. It is rather the non-rational, the unprethinkable, which has as its end the rational, the ordered, and the intelligible. Unprethinkable being is the fact of being derempted of all essence, existence without categorical determination. It is impossible to directly think, but impossible not to think, because it is co-thought with anything categorically thought. It is impossible to define because it is essenceless. It is impossible to directly experience, but it is co-experienced in everything we experience. It can neither be denied nor in any meaningful way affirmed, for it has no whatness that would allow us to affirm it. Here, as in the Mahayana Buddhist experience of suchness, tathata, Language must be deployed in a purely indexical and self-annihilating register. The pure that, das rein das, of any experience, any thought, however humble or grand, is what is wanted. The next section is, what does God have to do with it? Schelling roughs out what shall come to be known as the logic of abduction in an effort to argue that the pure that prevails as God. More prosaically, he argues for divine personality as the best explanation for why there is an emergent order in the first place. The argument is not deductive or a priori, but empirical. But it does not generalize on the basis of the empirically given. Rather, Schelling constructs the most comprehensive account of what might ultimately be the case to make sense of certain recalcitrant facts. Given the equiprimordiality of chaos and order, why does anything work out at all? Why does history appear meaningful? If not yet in its entirety, then at least in part. Why does love, from the continuity of things ordered as antecedent to consequent, to the free self-donation of one will to another, exist? The argument that these things are so because the universe is created by a providential but infinite and so infinitely inscrutable, yet nevertheless personalizing divinity is not a certain conclusion, but a falsifiable offering of an explanans, which can be reasonably refuted. But any refutation, like the argument itself, commits the thinker to a certain kind of existence, because it rests on the recognition or denial of certain facts, which the arguer holds as decisive to either maintaining or refuting the argument. The argument drives philosophy, or the philosopher, into confession and commitment. If you would live in a world in which chaos does not ultimately triumph over order, in which history is not absurd, but revelatory of a still to be fully comprehended meaning, and in which love is not only real, but the one thing worth living and dying for, then you must offer some explanation for the existence of order, meaning, and love. Following this line, Schelling speculates that being does not begin divine, but may in fact end as such. Being is pre-divine, pre-personal, pre-predicative. It is that which will exist as the infinite God, if in fact God will come to exist at all. But being is not itself God. God is posited not as the antecedent in this speculative theology, the all too familiar first cause, but as the consequent, not the beginning of everything, as in the onto-theological tradition, but the end of everything. Being, Schelling writes, is the primordial contingency itself, der Urzufall selbst, the contingency which is through itself, which has no cause outside of itself, and from which all other contingencies are derived, end quote. Being, therefore, is to be sharply distinguished from the essential necessity of any subsequently revealed divine nature, which would be, in relation to it, a contingent necessity. God, Schelling concludes, in his most deeply heterodox swerve, if he in fact wills to exist, will exist contingently, as a matter of fact, freely, as the non-necessary consequent of the antecedent event of being. My last section is titled, or is headed off by the question, why does it matter? Much more could be said about the speculative theology of the late Schelling, and in particular, much more needs to be said about its essential relationship to the speculative Christology of St. Paul. But it's time for me to conclude and return to the question in the title of this talk. Why does the late Schelling's critique of idealism still matter? There are two answers, or rather two parts to one answer to this question. The first part concerns the principle of reason. The second concerns the existence of the most surprising fact of all, love. First, the late Schelling reminds an age, our age, prone to the philosophical despair that Socrates called misologism, despair of reason, that philosophy alone is called to think and risk a judgment concerning the meaning of history. Weary as we are of the ignorance and violence produced by the history of metaphysics and religion, overwhelmed by the technology that has rapidly outpaced our moral sense of how to use it, and weakened by a century of intellectual decline, our age is only too inclined to give up on philosophy. We see this in our universities, where the decision to cancel programs of philosophy in favor of more lucrative pursuits has become distressingly common. We see it in a more subtle way in the contemporary practice of philosophy itself, divided as it is between reductionist naturalism, the thesis that being simply is, without either an antecedent or a consequent reason, so stop looking for one, and obscurantism, the related thesis that reason is not only inadequate to its own task, it is distortive of the real, so stop trying. Schelling reminds us that the decision concerning meaning can only be settled speculatively, and that the principle of reason is non-negotiable, since it will always be presupposed even by the naturalist and the obscurantist who attempts to deploy it against itself. It may be the fate of all finite determinations and concepts to fail in the face of the ongoing event of reality, but such failure is not fatal to philosophy, quite the contrary. The reductive naturalist has always jumped the gun by assuming that that which is to be explained is complete. Nothing further from the event of being is to be expected. The obscurantist, with equal impatience, has also jumped the gun by assuming that that which is to be explained is not ultimately intelligible. Naturalists and obscurantists have overstated their case. They have claimed more certainty than is given them because they have assumed closure in a history of being that is still ongoing. The second part of the answer, why does this matter, is bound to be more controversial. Schelling holds, and his claim has never been more relevant in my view, that we have reasons to believe that history shall culminate in the redemption of humanity. This is a claim which is as old as Paul's letters, but which is also not foreign to non-Christian traditions. It lies at the core of Schelling's philosophy of revelation, and it is the leitmotif of James Bradley's recently published collected essays in speculative philosophy. The claim is not only speculative, it is also unstoppably social political, for it is the secret drive behind every revolution. The claim is, in essence, that the meaning of history is, or shall be, love. The universe is producing love, what Bradley calls unconditional concern, either by design or by resistance or through some mediation by evolutionary chance, we do not yet know. But the fact of love, the persistence of the will to love, remains to be explained. The naturalists stake their case on the opposing claim that love is illusory and it would be better had we never been born. That they have less reasons in support of their case than they presume to have is, to be sure, not a demonstration that the meaning of history is love. But it ought to give us pause to reflect more carefully on certain curious features of human experience. In 10 compressed and extraordinary essays, my late colleague James Bradley argues that speculative philosophy really only begins with the late Schelling, even if it comes to its climax in Peirce. Speculative philosophy develops methods, principally abductive logic, and what Bradley calls the speculative generalization of the function, that permit us to venture to think the new without surrendering the explanatory telos of thought. Bradley endeavors, in his own words, to clean up Schelling's admittedly less than clean arguments. He conceives of an intelligible yet still incomplete emergent reality which originates in infinite activity and heads towards perfection. It does not begin there, but it may end there. A perfection which it will not impose on being, but freely elicit from the contingencies it sets loose. The a priori, as Schelling argued, is not a pre-existing determination or idea, but a triune pattern, the potencies, which only emerges for us historically, a pattern that can and indeed must be conceived abstractly, without any empirical reference, purely a priori, like the objects of mathematics, and yet must always stand open to revision in the face of the existent, the always new, the recalcitrant datum. For Bradley, Schelling's is the first move in a trajectory of speculative philosophy which will wisely abandon the stagnant deductivism of the metaphysics of substance, as well as the conceptually inadequate nominalism of empiricism, while taking seriously the empirical challenge to think the new, the singular exception to the rule, but to think it as the progressive unfolding event of being as love. My next and last quote is from James Bradley's collected essays. This is his last essay, the last talk he gave in 2012, and it's called Philosophy and Trinity. Bradley writes, "Being is love as unconditional giving or donation, unconditional concern, agape. Only in this way can the spontaneity and individuality of things, and in particular, the contingent evolution of physical nature, be properly secured. And the reason is that unconditional concern is open to what it does not control or determine. It does not stand in opposition to contingency as a lower moment of some absolute completeness, for unconditional concern surrenders itself to contingency. We see this in parental love, in all genuine love. And it is this infinite love that is the active condition of order in the universe, the ground of the complications that wherever possible accompany ordination." End quote. Bradley is building on C.S. Peirce's essay, Evolutionary Love here, but in the background of both Bradley and Peirce is Schelling's claim that being begins in the unprethinkable event, and through a process of decision gives rise to multiplicity, order, and the possibility of a freely willed harmony. To be sure, Schelling goes farther than Whitehead, Peirce, or even Bradley will be comfortable going. For Schelling, history itself is a self-revelation of a triune God who is not only infinitely concerned with us and our suffering from a distance, he has in fact become one of us for the sake of our flourishing. This is, of course, not an original argument, and Schelling would be the last to claim that it was. It is the argument of Paul, the argument of the author of the Gospel of John, the argument of Origen, of Augustine and Aquinas, and countless others. But even philosophy, which perhaps must remain formally agnostic, if not atheist, may be able to recognize that Schelling's speculative philosophy frees up our will to hope that that which shall finally emerge may turn out to be better than what we could possibly anticipate. It may in fact vindicate our desire for justice, even as it restores and justifies, in Paul's phrase, quote, "Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy." End quote. And thank you for your attention.